So if you're comfortable now with copying and pasting buttons and moving them in a test plan, the next step would be grouping buttons. So grouping is useful for copying, moving, and deleting buttons in a batch process. And so let me show you what that looks like. The first place you encounter it is if you're in the editor and you select more than one button to copy and paste into a panel. When you paste more than one button, they come in as a group with a single owner. Now, in addition to that, you can also manually group buttons together. So if I were to grab the same 3 buttons and place them individually, like this, I could also group these buttons together by selecting all 3, right-clicking, and then choosing Group Selected, and then giving it Group. So this just puts a generic grouping block around it. So now I can move these buttons all together just by right-clicking and holding. They all move together as one. Now, just the same as you can group them, you can also ungroup them by right-clicking on the bounding box and then selecting Group, and then they go back to where they were before, where they move around individually again. Now this also works when you copy and paste buttons from other test plans. So if I come over to my other test plan here, I can select multiple buttons and measurement blocks. And when I paste them, they come in with a bounding box around them, so I can move them into position, and then I can remove that bounding box if I want. Now, another useful thing is when you have buttons grouped, you can delete them as a batch as well. So if I group these buttons back together again, I can delete buttons individually, or I can delete them in a single batch, and it just depends where you right-click. So if I right-click on a single button, I can delete an individual button from a grouping. If I want to delete all the buttons in a group, you just right-click on the bounding box and then select Delete. Now, in addition, you can also do this to buttons that haven't been grouped yet. You can think of this as kind of a shortcut way. If I want to delete individual buttons as a batch, I highlight all 3 of them in this case, and then right-click on any one of them, select Group Selected, but then instead of grouping it, I can just come up here to delete, and I can do a batch delete that way. So you can move them together as a group, you can delete them as a group, but also another useful feature is actually to contract and expand buttons, and I'll show you what that looks like. So say I bring in a group of buttons. So I'm going to bring back in my 3 individual buttons, and I'll group them together. So if I group these 3 together, and I have them within a bounding box, I can right-click on this bounding box and select Settings, and then Contract. And then it pops up in this window and asks me what I want to name this contracted group as. And so I'll just call this touch control buttons. So this gives us the option now to fit a lot more buttons into the same panel if we want to by grouping them together and then contracting them down to a single button. And then the same operation that contracts them down is also the operation to expand them back. So if I right-click on my contracted button, go back to Settings, and then I can click on Expand, and I'm back to where I started again. Now this also works for calculation buttons and saves. So to give you an example, if I come up here, let's bring in this whole algorithm here for computing IP3. So it brings it all in as a group. So I'm going to ungroup these, and then I only want to contract just the algorithm part. So I'm going to leave the arrays and the instrument measurements on one side out of it, and then I'm also going to leave the save. So I'm just going to be all the calculations and data manipulations I'm going to group together. And then once I have a bounding box around this, I can contract this. And I can call it IP3 measurement. And so the software can figure out if it's got inputs and outputs and we contract it down, then it can create those input and output boxes for us and make this much more reasonable in the same amount of space. So that's the basics of grouping. Please comment and give us feedback on this video and others you'd like to see. And for more information, check out our other videos as well as download the Cassini user manual from the Apple iBook store.